sentiment in St. Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, that second reading that we just heard. An unusual sentiment for most of Scripture kind of quotations that we often hear. Here's the point I'm making. A lot of times when people quote Scripture today, in the controversial days in which we live, the controversies of the church and state and government and politics and all that, there's usually a pointed kind of semi-criticism, full criticism, even condemnation. But that's not what's happening in this letter here that Paul writes to the Thessalonians. And God bless you, Luke, for being able to pronounce Thessalonians so easily. It's not easy to do. Here's what's happening that leads up to Paul's letter to the Thessalonians. Paul would establish these communities. He would be going through Greek areas, what we call Asia Minor, all these Greek cities near the coastline of the Mediterranean Sea. And he would first start by preaching in the synagogues, because he was a Jew. He himself had been a Pharisee. And he would start talking about Jesus as the fulfillment of what the Jewish community was looking for. Jesus the Messiah, Jesus the Son of Man, Jesus who is to come and who has died and risen. Initially, he would have some success. There was, in fact, though, a group of people who were following him. People called the Judaizers, kind of a trivial name for you to remember. They don't come up much in the Scriptures. But here's what they did. They would pick apart and criticize everything that Paul did. And they eventually would turn most of the synagogue, the Jewish community, against Paul. And then he would go out into the streets, into the marketplace, to anybody who would listen, Gentiles, pagans, whoever it was. And he would proclaim the same thing, that God had sent the Messiah, that we were saved by the dying and rising of Christ. And he would develop a following, small following. Wasn't a mega church. Maybe 10, 12 families, at the most 100 to 200 people. And he would form them into kind of a community, a church, an ecclesia. And once that had happened, and he would have someone sort of begin to lead there, he would go on to the next city. Now, he didn't forget about the people where he had been. He would get messages, he would send messages. Sometimes he would ask for help from them. Sometimes they would help other communities. But he hadn't heard from the Thessalonians. He's traveling with two of his companions. Paul's traveling with Timothy and Silvanus. So he sends Timothy back to the Thessalonians and says, go find out what's happening there. Are they okay? It probably took a couple of weeks, maybe 2 months, for Timothy to go back to Thessalonica and to spend some time there and then come back and report to Paul. They didn't have Instagram and email and all the things we have. And Timothy comes back with great news, how well the community is doing, how they're becoming an influence. Their good name and their good actions are influencing all of Macedonia, sort of an area that we would call Greece today. Paul is elated at that. So he writes back to congratulate them, to tell them how he's heard such good things about them. Now, he didn't write to everybody like that. If you read the letter to the Corinthians, there's some pretty strong criticism. Galatians, he just flips out on the Galatians. The Ephesians, he's got some critical things to say, but not the Thessalonians. He's congratulating them, lifting them up, pointing out the good that they're doing that he's now heard about, and encouraging them in that. So here's a lesson I'm asking us to consider. Can we be like that? To look at the good that's happening around us. To look at the good that's happening in families, in workplaces, in the larger community, in the neighborhood. To look at the good that's happening in the parish and in the larger church. And congratulate people for it, lift people up for it. We've become good at the opposite, haven't we, in this culture? We're surrounded in the media, we're surrounded on the internet, surrounded in all kinds of blogs and YouTubes with criticism. And we tend to that. I mean, I have to be honest about myself. Maybe you can be honest about yourself. We tend to see the negative more. And that's what we comment on. That's what we talk about a lot. The things that are going wrong. So I'm going to challenge us. I'm challenging myself. to look at the good that's happening and the people who are doing good things and encourage them. Maybe be specific about it. Here's a great thing you're doing. I appreciate it. I want to lift that up and tell you how much it means to me to see you doing that. Here's what I'm not suggesting. I'm not suggesting that we have some kind of rose-colored glasses and unrealistic idealism that says, well, I'll just talk about the good things. Because there's some bad. There's some things that need to be challenged. We have to challenge one another. I want to be held accountable. I want to be responsible to you and to those who I answer to. But I don't need to hear it all the time. Here's a way to do it, though. To accentuate what's going right, and where there's a need for criticism, to say, how can I help with that? Are you struggling with that? How are things really going? Can I help you with that? Can I walk side by side with you through that? You don't have to face it alone. And certainly you don't have to face it in secret through gossip, but that's a homily for another day. In the gospel, Jesus has a suggestion. Now let me set up a little bit of background on the gospel, if you'll allow me to do that. The last 4 or 5 weeks, St. Matthew has begun each of these little gospel segments we've had by introducing people who are out to get Jesus. People who don't like him, who are challenging him, who are looking to trip him up, right? Sort of reminds me of the old saying, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you anyway. Who were these groups? Well, the Herodians, the elders of the people, the scribes, the Sadducees, the Pharisees. In fact, he begins this gospel by saying, when the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, Jesus must have been a great debater. He just shut the Sadducees down completely, took their arguments, turned them around, and they had nowhere to go. They were silenced. Well, they're going to keep coming at him, these Pharisees. Which is the greatest commandment? Waiting to see if he would mess it up. He quotes back to them an ancient Jewish prayer. It comes from Deuteronomy and Numbers. It's repeated in a couple places in the Old Testament. It's called the Shema. Jewish people say it today as part of morning, evening, daytime prayer. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is Lord alone, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your strength, all your soul. How can they argue against that? That's their own prayer. But then Jesus expands it and says, and the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. Thomas Aquinas, a great philosopher of our Catholic tradition, defined love in this way. Love is willing the good of the other. Willing, in other words, making a conscious decision, an intentional choice to assist, to pray for, to enable the good of the other. That's what Jesus is talking about. He's not talking about feeling love for everybody. He's talking about choosing to love, willing the good of the other, even if you may not like them very much. Even if they don't will your good. Willing the good of the other. Taking that prayer, Shema, connecting a New Testament insight, which brings us back to the point I was making about Thessalonians. We live in a hyper-angry society. We live in a society where there's terrible criticisms at all levels, almost to the point where we can't move forward because there's so much pushing back. What if Catholic Christians became known as the people who build one another up, who encourage the good that's all around them, who deal with the criticisms and deal with the stuff that has to be dealt with? We're not naive about real troubles that have to be faced. But we do that in a way that says, I will help you through it. I'll stand by you. I won't just criticize and walk away. Pretty tall order. But I think it's worth thinking about. To that end, one example. I do this a lot, but this example came up on Friday. I was called on Friday to 2 different nursing homes by hospice staff to visit 2 different people who had no connection to this parish. The hospice person was just looking for whatever priest would answer the phone. Families weren't present when I got there. But oftentimes when I am called on those, people who have no connection to our parish, but they're calling because the person is very close to death. When there is family present, here's what I start with. Tell me something about your dad. Tell me something about your mom, your child, your parent, whoever it is that is in distress. And sometimes 20, 25 minutes later, people are still talking about this person that we're about to pray with. Great stories, beautiful memories, sometimes a lot of tears, often just as much laughter. That's true of everybody in this church, too. Every one of you has a story. Every one of you has great things about you and some challenging things. You're surrounded by heroes here. You don't even know it. Maybe you do. Maybe you've taken some time to get to know some people and you know what people are carrying on their shoulders, how in very small ways they're doing great things, or maybe in very great ways they're facing burdens. It's important for us to build one another up for the good that's happening, facing the troubles that we have to. What a difference it would make in marriages, in family life, if our first inclination was to say, you know, I really appreciate you, and here's the specific reasons why. After this Mass, you're invited to come over to the Celebration Center to the Ministry Fair. You're going to be amazed at how many ministries happen around this parish and the wider community representing you, taking the name of this parish out into the community. Folks who are willing, even though we're living in challenging times, to do what they can where we are with what we have to build up, to help, to do better. I'd encourage you to go to the ministry fair, even if you can't stay, even if you can just maybe say to one or two people who are doing ministries, I appreciate you, appreciate what you do. I never knew that ministry was going on. Tell me something about it. We have to build one another up. We can make a difference. The Thessalonians had a powerful impact in their world. Paul says it clearly, and he's proud of them for it. And we can be proud of one another in the same way. Love God, love your neighbor, will the good of the other. Let's build one another up. Makes it a whole lot better facing the problems when we know people around us are really advocating for us, care about us, see the good that we do. May God's grace continue to fill our families in that way.